Um, Understanding the differences between EHR and EDC is important as you think about these challenges. In many ways, they're very similar. They're both designed to document information about subjects or patients using a computer. Both are generally forms-driven or maybe and or protocol-driven, but the differences are pretty dramatic as well, too. It's really the pharmaceutical industry and CROs that purchase the EDC systems and deploy them, and they're designed to collect information for the purpose of science, and they're regulated by FDA as compared to on the EHR side. Regulation is, or at least the certification process is CCHIT. Malpractice drives some of the reasoning behind detailed documentation as well as payment issues, and they're purchased by physicians and practices, which is a completely different set of stakeholders. Next slide, please. As you look at the adoption of, it's a build slide, so you may have to click it 2 or 3 times to complete the build, please. It's important to see that EDC, while it's been deployed and it has been gradually increasing over time, you're seeing that as EHR adoption accelerates now over the course of the next couple of years, that many more practices will have both when they're conducting research, an EHR and EDC, and so the need for this harmonization effort is increasing, and as the adoption of both dramatically increases. Next slide, please. One more. There you go. Another thing I think is worth mentioning is privacy and secondary uses of data. It's very important that as we develop new regulatory rules and new guidance for the uses of EHR and how privacy is to be maintained, that we need to make sure there's an appropriate balance between privacy concerns, which are very important, but with the potential benefits to society of being able to mine electronic patient data in a secure manner. You can have it both ways as long as the rules are established carefully and they're balanced, and the rules have to be clear. If the rules are not clear, people will stay away from it just to avoid legal concerns and anything that's a gray area they want to stay away from. So it's important that whatever rulemaking takes place, that it's very, very clear to all the stakeholders and that it's balanced. And improving population health and the prevention of pandemics, and it requires analytics and surveillance of patient data. So it would be a shame if all this great data was suddenly available because everyone began using EHRs, but it couldn't be used to help solve some of the most pressing health questions. And so it's important that privacy be balanced and be done appropriately. Next slide, please. So what next? The one thing just to mention real briefly is that there should be standards for the use of electronic health records in clinical trials and research, and there should be a special CCHIT certification for it. It's something that is beginning to be discussed, and I believe there is now a work group beginning to define the use cases around that. I know Eli Lilly and Allscripts and others are involved in, and we're supportive of that, as I believe the industry is. And appreciate your time once again, and I'll be available for questions later. Thanks again, Steve.
Thank you very much, Steve. You've heard a perspective from academia, from government, and from a EHR vendor. From me, you will hear some common themes that you've heard already. That's okay, since key messages need reinforcement and prioritization. You might see some different colors of these themes as part of my presentation. So I'm pleased to give the pharma perspective, noting that I'm not speaking for capital P Pharma, the trade organization that represents our industry. I will also note that for simplicity of exposition, I will use the term pharma to mean pharmaceutical and biotech companies, and the term drugs to encompass drugs and bioproducts that are regulated by FDA and others. I will also note up front that I'm speaking from a perspective, let's see, I better advance this, yep, there we go, perspective of regulated clinical research, which is what we do in the pharma and biotech industry. By that I mean the research we do that is subject to review and oversight by FDA and other regulatory agencies around the world. I mention this because regulated clinical research requires exceptional levels of documentation, security, and privacy, as well as data integrity. I like to start with the end in mind and remind us of our vision: ubiquitous clinical data and information that is accessible and available in a timely manner. I think we all share this high-level vision of ubiquity of clinical data and information, and we all believe that this will improve the way healthcare is delivered to patients. From a research perspective, I like to translate that vision into a slightly more granular level by using the following couplet that I'll ask you to remember. Research data at the point of care means that we can take the latest and best findings and translate them into evidence-based medicine in something less than the oft-quoted 17 years. Clinical care data at the point of research means that research hypotheses can be answered efficiently from an operational perspective and effectively from a scientific perspective. This creates a virtuous cycle in which good answers from such research hypotheses can be turned into additional evidence and decision support to supply physicians at the point of care. With that high-level vision and framework, I will now describe some specific problems faced by the pharmaceutical development world, some of which you've heard, and solutions that are being pursued or contemplated by the industry and FDA, and where organizations like NEHC could help add some rocket fuel to those solutions, and the value such solutions can bring to drug development, the healthcare system, and ultimately the patients we serve. I'll use some color coding so you can track the various dimensions I am covering in the talk more closely. First, clinical research. Clinical trials are meant to be scientific experiments to test a specific hypothesis or a select few hypotheses. Drug development trials and programs are getting larger all the time, but they are relatively small compared to the populations that receive the drugs if they make it to the market. Similarly, drug development trials are tending to be longer in duration, but in some disease states they are shorter than what is the expected duration of treatment in practice. Such limitations are simply the nature of research. As such, clinical trials are approximations of what happened in the routine delivery of healthcare, and inference must be made as to the applicability of the clinical research to the clinical care setting. By accessing clinical care data, we have the opportunity to analyze the impact of our treatments when they are given in the context of patients with additional comorbidities, lack of compliance or adherence to prescribed medications, and, well, in short, the complexities of real life. There are many such databases emerging and growing today, with just a few examples shown here. Access to such anonymized data by pharma, biotech, and their research partners allows for assessment of treatment effects in the real world, including more sophisticated benefit-risk assessments. Access to this data also allows research companies to gain both deeper and broader understanding of our maladies and greater refinement of our knowledge of the uniqueness of each individual patient and how their needs can be met. With broad integration of such electronic data, more sophisticated modeling can be done, including economic modeling of not only the cost, but the value of our therapies. As a researcher, I must note that while some data can provide valuable insights to inform healthcare, there are considerable complexities with extracting those valuable insights due to the many confounding factors that influence patient outcomes in such uncontrolled settings. As reported by CenterWatch, and as you've heard here, patient enrollment in trials is consistently the #1 contributor to the delays in clinical development. This is due to a combination of not having enough physicians who are willing to be clinical investigators in clinical trials, as well as a lack of awareness of patients about the existence and process of clinical trials. Lack of physician participation is often driven by the additional rigorous requirements for doing regulated clinical research. One very notable impediment is the dual data entry problem, by which I mean that physicians under the current processes for clinical research must record the patient data twice, once for their own records and once for the sponsor of the clinical research. Furthermore, whether sponsor data is collected on paper or through special electronic data capture systems from the sponsor, investigators who participate in multiple clinical trials can have greater complications with data collection and documentation, as seen in this figure. The solution to this problem is the well-known phrase in the modern IT world: collect once, reuse often. I will give you a quick and very high-level walkthrough of this solution in the next schema. Clinical trial sponsors start with defining what data needs to be collected to meet the requirements of their clinical trial. They create an electronic case report form for the study. An electronic message is sent to the investigator site system detailing the data collection specifications, what data elements, their valid values, the format, the data type, etc. The investigator's EHR system reads that message and searches its database for those data elements on the patient that is enrolled in the clinical trial. The system pre-populates the fields of the case report form for which it has data, lessening the burden on the investigative site. Since the clinical trial generally collects more data and different data than is done in clinical practice, the investigative site enters the additional data on the patient. When the case report form is complete, it can be added to the EHR and automatically sent to a trusted third party that ensures privacy and secure storage. This is also where an audit trail is kept for regulatory review if necessary. The data is then sent back to the clinical trial sponsor for aggregation with other patient data for the trial. While this may seem to be a simple explanation and description, there are considerable complexities similar to the issues faced with implementing an EHR in almost any care setting. Furthermore, there are regulatory issues related to the level of documentation in clinical care versus clinical trials. EHR vendors need to develop new and sometimes complex functionality. For example, randomization of patients to blinded treatments to facilitate unique aspects of clinical trials. And if that's not enough, large-scale clinical trials are done across many sites, typically dozens, and many times hundreds of sites. So the solution must work across many different EHRs. Oh, by the way, did I mention multinational clinical trials, which are also routinely done in drug development? At Eli Lilly and many other companies, clinical trials can involve investigators from North America, Western and Eastern Europe, South America, India, China, Japan, Australia, and more. Achieving this kind of interoperability for global clinical drug development is daunting and can only be achieved efficiently through the use of detailed global content and messaging standards. Such interoperability between clinical care EHRs and pharma biotech clinical research data systems will help create another virtuous cycle. Easier data collection lessens the burden on investigators, which lowers the barrier of entry for their involvement in clinical research, which gives more patients access to clinical research studies, which enhances enrollment of patients in clinical trials, which helps to eliminate one of the biggest problems in clinical drug development. The ultimate outcome is accelerated development of new drugs at lower cost, benefiting patients who are waiting for better treatments and benefiting the healthcare system as a whole. This brings me to the next vision of large, simple trials. These have been discussed in the medical and statistical literature for a few decades, but the implementation could be significantly facilitated by the approaches outlined here. How? That brings me to the next couplet that I want you to remember. Imagine a world in which every physician is a potential investigator in a clinical trial and every patient is a potential trial participant. In this world, we can do research that has the rigor to answer scientific and medical questions while working in a more real-life setting. Now that's transformational, both operationally and scientifically. On to safety surveillance. When drugs make it to the market, pharma companies continue to monitor safety through pharmacovigilance programs. In fact, I have heard estimates of $500 to $800 million being spent annually across the industry in monitoring adverse events for marketed products. However, it is well known that there is a significant underreporting of adverse events by physicians in their clinical practice. This makes timely detection of safety signals quite difficult. Why is there such underreporting? The usual approach for adverse event reporting in the U.S. is the MedWatch form. First, the physician is supposed to fill out a paper form with numerous fields to complete, including information on lot numbers, expiration dates, and NDC codes.